The wind came off the Rhine at 0417, carrying the smell of wet ash and something sweeter underneath. Bodies in the rubble 3 streets east, unrecovered since Tuesday. Captain James Whitfield stood at the edge of what had been a municipal building's second floor, now open to the April sky, and watched the German town of Wesel burn in 17 separate places. He was 31 years old, born in Brampton, Ontario, the son of a railway clerk who had spent 40 years scheduling freight cars and died believing his boy would do the same. Whitfield had joined the Canadian Army in 1940, served competently in Italy, and found himself attached to 21st Army Group headquarters as a liaison officer because he spoke passable German and had once, in another life, studied philosophy at McGill. Neither qualification had prepared him for what he was about to witness. He had studied philosophy long enough to understand that most questions about how men ought to behave collapse under pressure into simpler questions about what men can survive having done. He had not understood this as a student. He had understood it at casino, watching a 20-year-old from Halifax die on the wrong side of a ruined wall because someone senior had confused 2 grid references. The philosophy he carried now was smaller and more durable than anything McGill had offered. It fit in your chest cavity. It weighed nothing. And it was the only thing that made the smell of April ash tolerable. The briefing that morning had been routine. Montgomery's staff moved through the daily intelligence summaries with the mechanical precision Whitfield had come to expect. Enemy formations identified, supply routes interdicted, prisoner counts tabulated. The Rhine crossing was 48 hours behind them now, and the war felt like it was ending in the way all large machinery ends. Slowly at first, then with sudden, catastrophic speed. Whitfield had stopped believing in neat conclusions somewhere in Sicily, watching good men die for objectives that changed names 3 times before anyone could spell them correctly. He had stood through the briefing with the particular attention of a man whose job is to translate rather than decide. The translation work was not only linguistic. He moved between British staff culture and the various other cultures that constituted the Allied enterprise, and each translation required him to locate not just the words, but the assumptions behind them. British staff officers said things like, "The situation remains fluid," when they meant, "We have no reliable intelligence." They said, "We are exploring all options," when they meant, "Someone senior has already decided and is waiting for the paperwork to catch up." Whitfield had worked to work in the space between what was said and what was meant, which was perhaps why the brigadier had eventually found him useful for other purposes. He heard the rumor first from a signals corporal named Davies, a Welshman with nicotine-stained fingers who seemed to know everything that happened between the front lines and Brussels before anyone else did. Davies had been rewiring a field telephone when Whitfield passed the communications tent. The corporal glanced up, then back down at his work, and said without preamble, "There's something happening at the detention facility, sir. Something unusual." Whitfield had learned not to press Davies for details. The man dispensed information like a miser counting coins, a little at a time, always leaving you wanting more. He walked the 400 meters to the temporary detention compound instead, following the sound of engines and raised voices. The sun was still low, barely clearing the eastern roofline of what remained of Wesel's commercial district, and the light it threw across the rubble was the pale gold of early morning that makes damaged things look like they belong in paintings. Whitfield had learned to distrust that light. It had a way of making the world seem comprehensible at exactly the moments when it was not. The facility was a converted warehouse on the eastern edge of town, brick walls still standing though the roof had partially collapsed. Military police had strung concertina wire around the perimeter and established checkpoints at 2 entrances. Whitfield showed his identification to a sergeant who looked too young to shave and too old in the eyes, then stepped inside. The air changed immediately, colder, damper, thick with the smell of unwashed men and inadequate sanitation. Prisoners sat in clusters on the concrete floor, sorted by apparent rank. Enlisted men near the entrance, NCOs in the middle section, officers toward the back where a few intact offices still provided separation. Whitfield counted perhaps 200 men in the main space, their faces showing the particular blankness of defeat that he had seen before in Casino, in Normandy, in a dozen nameless crossroads where the Wehrmacht had finally stopped moving forward. He moved through them slowly, not because he was looking for anyone, but because moving slowly was the only way to look at something honestly. Fast movement was for men who already knew what they would find. The prisoners watched him with varying degrees of interest. Some tracked him with the eyes of men calculating odds. Others did not bother to raise their heads. One soldier near the middle section, young, perhaps 18, the collar of his uniform still bearing the insignia of a division, Whitfield recognized from Italian engagement records, was reading a small book, his thumb marking pages with an automaticity that suggested he was not reading at all, but performing the memory of reading, preserving something from before. But the rumor Davies had mentioned, that was happening somewhere else. Whitfield followed the sound of voices speaking English with various accents until he reached a corridor leading to what had been the warehouse manager's office. 2 military policemen flanked the door, and a third man stood with his back against the opposite wall, smoking a cigarette with the practiced patience of someone who had learned to wait in uncomfortable places. This third man was the first indication that something genuinely unusual was occurring. He wore British Army battle dress, but it hung on him wrong. Not poorly fitted, but deliberately loose in a way that suggested he had chosen the fit rather than accepted it. No rank insignia visible, no unit patches. His boots were German, Whitfield noticed, the standard Wehrmacht issue that every Allied soldier learned to recognize, and they were worn in a pattern that suggested thousands of kilometers on foot rather than hundreds. The man's face was unremarkable except for a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, thin and white, healed years ago. He might have been 30 or 45. The war had erased such distinctions for men who lived in it rather than through it. There was something in his posture that Whitfield found difficult to name. It was not the posture of a man at rest, and it was not the posture of a man alert in the ordinary military sense. It was something between those states, a quality of readiness that did not announce itself, the way a spring holds tension without displaying it. He had seen this quality once before, in a wire-walking performer at a circus in Toronto he had attended at the age of 11. The man had crossed a wire 70 feet above the arena floor with a stillness that looked like calm, but was in fact the opposite of calm. It was total muscular engagement distributed so evenly across the body that it registered as absence of effort. Whitfield had not thought of that circus performer in 20 years. He thought of him now. Whitfield approached and introduced himself. The man looked at him for 3 full seconds without responding. Not hostile, not calculating, simply present, in a way that made Whitfield suddenly aware of his own breathing. Renwick, the man said finally. He did not offer a rank or unit. There was a commotion inside the office. Whitfield heard Montgomery's chief of intelligence, a brigadier named Williams, whom he had met twice at staff conferences, speaking in the clipped tones that senior officers used when they wanted to sound patient and were not. Another voice responded in German, cultured, educated German, the kind spoken in universities and ministries rather than barracks. Whitfield understood enough to catch fragments, names, places, something about records hidden before the advance reached them. The German speaker was offering information with the desperate fluency of a man who believed his words were the only currency that might still buy something. There was a particular quality to bargaining under those conditions that Whitfield had come to recognize, a speeding up of speech, as if volume and velocity could substitute for value, a tendency to repeat key phrases with slight variations, the way a man with a bad hand in cards keeps rearranging his holdings in case the order changes their worth. Renwick finished his cigarette and crushed it under his German boot. Without looking at Whitfield, he said, "This is the 3rd one this week. They all think they have something we want." Before Whitfield could ask what he meant, the office door opened and Brigadier Williams emerged, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who had just been offered something valuable and found it contaminated. Behind him, 2 MPs escorted a German officer in the black uniform of the SS, a Standartenführer, Whitfield noted, equivalent to a full colonel, with the death's head insignia still visible on his collar, though someone had torn away his sleeve decorations. The SS officer was perhaps 50, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man accustomed to giving orders, and the slightly wild eyes of one who had recently discovered that bearing no longer mattered. He was speaking rapidly, still offering, still bargaining, listing names and dates and locations that tumbled over each other in his haste to be heard. His German was precise even now, the syntax clean, the vocabulary formal, and Whitfield understood enough to follow the general shape of what was being offered. Locations of document caches, names of subordinates who had preserved certain files against orders, access protocols for records that had been sealed rather than destroyed. Williams stopped and turned to face him. The brigadier said nothing for a long moment, simply looked at the man with an expression Whitfield had never seen on a staff officer's face. Not anger, not contempt, but something colder, something final. Then Williams spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Standartenführer Beckman, you commanded the security detachment at Oradour-sur-Glane. You have offered us intelligence regarding hidden SS records in exchange for consideration. Field Marshal Montgomery has reviewed your case. Williams paused. The German's face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession. Hope, calculation, fear, settling finally on something that might have been understanding. The Field Marshal's response, Williams continued, is that the information you offer, even if genuine, cannot purchase what you seek. You will be transferred to French custody within the hour. They have been waiting for you. The German began to speak again, the words coming faster now, higher pitched. Whitfield caught references to other operations, other officers, locations of documents that could prove valuable to Allied intelligence for years. The man was no longer bargaining, he was pleading, though his voice had not quite reached that register yet. There was still a remnant of official bearing in the way he held his shoulders, the way he directed his words toward Williams as if addressing a tribunal rather than a man. He had spent decades in systems that rewarded the performance of authority, and the performance continued even now, even here, even when the audience had already decided. Renwick moved then, stepping away from the wall with a fluidity that made Whitfield think of water finding its level. He crossed to where the MPs held the German officer and said something too quietly for Whitfield to hear. Whatever it was stopped the German mid-sentence. The man looked at Renwick, really looked, for the first time, and something in his expression changed. Whitfield would remember that moment for decades afterward, though he could never adequately describe it to anyone who had not been present. The German, who had commanded death squads and signed execution orders and lived for years in the certainty of his own authority, looked at a man in unmarked battle dress with German boots and a thin white scar, and recognized something. Not a threat, exactly, not revenge, something more elemental. Something that had no rank and no paperwork and no process of appeal. The SS officer stopped speaking. He allowed the MPs to lead him away without further protest, his eyes remaining on Renwick until the corridor turned and blocked the view. Williams exhaled slowly, then noticed Whitfield for the first time. "Captain," he said, his voice returning to its normal register, "you're the Canadian liaison, yes? Good. I need someone who speaks German and doesn't officially exist in any operational capacity. Walk with me." They moved through the warehouse, past the rows of ordinary prisoners, out into the April morning where the smell of ash had temporarily faded. Williams spoke as they walked, explaining in fragments. Standartenführer Beckman had commanded not only the security detachment during the Oradour massacre, but a network of document destruction that had erased evidence of 3 other atrocities before Allied forces could reach them. He had attempted to trade information about surviving records, locations, access arrangements, the names of clerks who had been ordered to preserve certain files against explicit Reichsfuhrer directives. He claimed the surviving records implicated men who would otherwise emerge from the collapse of the Reich untouched, men with useful skills and cooperative dispositions whom Allied intelligence services were already discussing in terms of future utility. Montgomery had listened to the summary. Montgomery had asked one question. Did the man give the orders at Oradour or simply receive them? When told the colonel had personally selected which buildings would be sealed before burning, standing in the village square while the screaming was still audible from the locked church, making administrative decisions about evidence, the field marshal had ended the conversation with 7 words. Give him to the people he wronged. Whitfield absorbed this. It was not the decision that surprised him. He had seen enough of the liberation to understand why certain men could not be permitted to purchase their futures with other people's pain. It was the speed of it, the absolute clarity, the lack of any hesitation or committee or further review. Montgomery had a reputation for deliberation, for demanding complete intelligence before committing, for the maddening patience that had frustrated American commanders from Eisenhower down. But there was apparently a category of question that required no deliberation at all, that resolved itself the moment it was posed, the way a correctly balanced equation needs no further work once you have recognized its form. Renwick had followed them outside. He stood now at a distance of perhaps 15 meters, watching the road where a convoy of supply trucks was passing, appearing entirely uninterested in the conversation between the brigadier and the Canadian captain. Williams noticed the direction of Whitfield's gaze. "That one," the brigadier said, lowering his voice, "has been attached to my intelligence section for 6 days. I have no written orders authorizing his presence. I have no documentation of his unit or his operations. I have, in fact, nothing except a verbal instruction from someone whose name I am not permitted to record." Williams paused, seemed to consider whether to continue, then did. "3 nights ago," he said, "one of our interrogation subjects, a Gestapo officer captured near Münster, stopped answering questions. Completely stopped, despite considerable motivation to cooperate. When asked why, he said he had recognized one of the men present in the room. He said that man had killed 11 of his colleagues in a single night in France, 9 months ago, and that he would rather face whatever punishment we offered than provide information that might give that man reason to remember his name." The brigadier looked directly at Whitfield. "I checked our records, Captain. We have no operation in France matching that description on any date. No after-action report, no casualty list, no requisition for ammunition or explosives. According to every document in 21st Army Group, the event the Gestapo officer described never happened." Whitfield felt the particular cold that came not from temperature, but from proximity to something outside normal parameters. He had experienced it before. In Italy, when artillery fell on a position that should not have been known to enemy spotters. In Normandy, when a patrol returned from a route that maps said did not exist. It was the cold of understanding that the world you were navigating was not the only world operating in the same space, that there were other structures, other systems, other chains of causation running parallel to the ones you could see, and occasionally they intersected your visible world at a single point and then withdrew, leaving only the effect and no legible cause. "So I asked around," Williams continued, quietly, the kind of asking that doesn't get written down. "And I learned that there are perhaps 300 men in the entire British Army who operate under rules I am not cleared to know. They answer to a chain of command that does not appear in any organizational chart. They have been doing things since 1941 that will not be declassified in our lifetimes. They move through the war the way water moves through rock, not by force, but by finding every passage that exists and using it before anyone has thought to seal it. They are deployed for purposes that would not survive formal authorization, against targets that cannot be named in operational orders, in circumstances where the existence of a written record would constitute the primary threat to the mission." The brigadier stopped walking. They had reached a point where the morning sun fell directly on them, weak but present, the first real warmth in days. The road ahead curved north toward what had been the town's market district, now largely flattened. Somewhere in that direction, at irregular intervals, there was still the sound of small arms fire. Not an engagement, just the administrative percussion of a battle finishing its paperwork. "I tell you this," Williams said, "because you're about to see something that officially isn't happening. And you need to understand that your job is to observe and report nothing. The French will take custody of Standartenführer Beckman. What happens after that is not your concern, not my concern, not anyone's concern who wishes to sleep peacefully." Whitfield asked the only question that seemed relevant. "Why am I here, then?" Williams smiled without humor. "Because someone needs to know, Captain. Not to record it, not to testify about it, not to write memoirs about it when they're old and the war's history. Just to know. So that later, much later, when people ask how we won, or how we kept our souls while winning, there will be someone who can say, 'I was there. I saw, and I cannot explain what I saw.'" He paused, and for a moment the professional surface of the briefing room officer fell away, and Whitfield saw something else underneath. Not sentiment, not doubt, but something that looked like the same quality he had recognized in Renwick, a kind of weight, the weight of decisions that have been made correctly, and are no lighter for that. The brigadier walked away then, leaving Whitfield alone in the April sunlight with the smell of ash returning on the shifting wind. Renwick remained at his position 15 meters distant, watching the road, watching nothing, watching everything. The French vehicle arrived 20 minutes later. It was a Citroën staff car, civilian rather than military, with a tricolor pennant mounted above the windscreen and 2 men in the front who did not look like military men and were not wearing military clothing. In the back seat, there was a third man who did not get out. The French officer who conducted the handover, if that was the right word, spoke to the MPs with the precision of a man completing a very long-delayed transaction. He signed one document. He was handed one document. He did not examine Beckman's face. Beckman himself said nothing during the transfer. He had stopped speaking entirely after Renwick's quiet words in the corridor, and he remained silent now, moving with a docility that sat strangely on his frame, on the posture that had not quite finished performing authority. He got into the rear of the Citroën. The door closed, the vehicle turned on the rubble-cleared road and drove north, toward whatever France had been preparing for him since the first survivors of Oradour had reached communities that would eventually tell someone with the authority to act. Whitfield stood there for perhaps 2 minutes after the vehicle disappeared, watching the dust settle back onto the road surface. When he turned to speak to Renwick, to say what, he did not know, perhaps simply to acknowledge what they had witnessed together, the operative was gone. Not walking away, not visible at any distance along the road or across the adjacent fields. Gone, as if the April afternoon had simply absorbed him back into itself. Whitfield scanned the tree line, the collapsed barn, the hedgerow running northeast toward what remained of the village. Nothing moved except a single crow lifting from a fence post. Renwick had been there, 15 meters distant, close enough to hear conversation. Now he was not there, and there was no interval between those two states that Whitfield could identify. He walked to where Renwick had been standing. The grass showed slight compression, boot prints perhaps, though the ground was too hard to be certain. No equipment left behind, no indication of direction. Whitfield looked at his watch. 14:23. He looked up. The road remained empty. The crow settled back onto its post. He stood for a while longer, and because he had studied philosophy, he thought briefly about what the visible presence of a thing guarantees about its nature. And because he had spent 4 years at war, he understood that this was the wrong question. The right question was not what Renwick's presence guaranteed, but what his absence cost. The answer was nothing. The absence cost nothing, damaged nothing, left no gap in anything essential. This was perhaps the most precise thing Whitfield could say about the man, that his vanishing was as complete as his effectiveness, and that both qualities arose from the same root. 3 hours later, at the temporary Canadian Army command post established in an undamaged farmhouse 8 kilometers south, a gray stone building whose owner had painted a red cross on the barn roof sometime during the winter, perhaps in hope, perhaps in accurate calculation of the building's value as a medical facility to whichever army arrived first, Whitfield attempted to write his report. He had been present for the transfer of a detained SS officer to French custody. He had witnessed the conclusion of a British intelligence process regarding Standartenführer Beckman, formerly of the Waffen-SS security apparatus, whose crimes were a matter of French judicial record. These facts were reportable. These facts were his job. He wrote, "At approximately 12:40 hours, I was present at the temporary detention facility in Wesel as Standartenführer Beckman, SS, was transferred to French civil authority pursuant to—" He stopped. Pursuant to what? There had been no formal extradition order. There had been no tribunal. There had been a brigadier's voice carrying 7 words from a field marshal who was 30 kilometers away, and a French staff car with men who did not identify themselves, and a document signed by a French officer whose name Whitfield had not caught, and then a road with dust settling back onto it. He wrote, "British intelligence personnel acting under authority derived from what? From the understanding that some things require no authority beyond the weight of what has been done? From the operational logic of an army that had liberated enough of France to know exactly what waited in the voices of the people waiting?" He crossed out the sentence. He had witnessed Beckman's offer. He had understood enough German to follow its substance. The locations of document caches in 3 separate areas of the Reich. The names of archivists who had preserved certain files in violation of destruction orders. The existence of a parallel record system that had been maintained as personal insurance by senior SS administrators who understood, perhaps as early as Stalingrad, that the Reich's permanence was not guaranteed. This was real intelligence. It had genuine value. Whitfield did not doubt that Allied intelligence services would have found it useful, would have acted on it, would have found some of those archives and some of those archivists and some of those hidden records. Montgomery had decided that this value could not be exchanged for Beckman's life, his freedom, his protection from French custody. Had decided it immediately, without process, in 7 words. Whitfield sat with this for a long time, his pen resting on the paper, the farmhouse sounds moving around him, a generator, somewhere outside, running on fuel that had been requisitioned from a depot 3 days east, a conversation between 2 sergeants about a card game, the distant coughing of an engine that did not want to start in the April cold. The question that sat in the middle of his blank page was not whether Montgomery had been right. He had been right. Whitfield was as certain of this as he was certain of anything the war had taught him. And the war had stripped away most of his certainties until only a few remained, dense and heavy as river stones. The question was something else. It was the question of what you do with the knowledge that the right decision and the costly decision are sometimes identical, and that the cost is measured not in the currency of the decision-maker, but in the currency of people who are not in the room. The intelligence Beckman offered would have found some of those archives. Those archives would have helped identify men who would otherwise disappear into the post-war administrative confusion that was already beginning, 3 weeks before the surrender, in the nervous calculations of people on both sides preparing for what came after. Some of those men would go on to do things. Some of those things would cost lives. Whitfield did not know which ones. He would never know. Montgomery could not have known. Williams had known and had executed the decision anyway, because there is a category of trade that, once made, poisons the currency you use to make it, and Beckman's currency was the bodies at Oradour, and you cannot buy good things with that. He wrote a single paragraph describing the transfer and noted that he had been present as an observer with no operational role. He left a space for the Standartenführer's documents and wrote, "Materials not available for review." He did not explain why. He folded the report and placed it in the correct envelope and wrote the correct reference numbers on the outside and left it on the pile for collection. Captain Morris found him an hour later, still sitting at the wooden table with the completed report beside him, and the look of a man who has just finished a calculation he knows is wrong, but cannot find the error in. "Anything interesting at the checkpoint?" Morris asked, pouring himself water from a canteen. Whitfield looked at him. Morris was 26, from somewhere in Virginia, had been in country since Normandy. He understood Germany. He understood the war. He had seen things that would never leave him, same as everyone. There was a quality to men who had been through the same passage that allowed them to speak in a kind of shorthand, the way long married couples can communicate complex information through a shift of weight or a particular silence. Whitfield and Morris had this, had built it over 8 months of proximity and shared bad coffee and the daily discipline of not talking about the things they had seen. There was an SS officer, Whitfield said. He tried to defect. "They're doing that now," Morris said. "Rats and ships." "What happened to him?" Whitfield opened his mouth to answer. The truth was simple. The British transferred him to French custody. 6 words. Morris would understand. Everyone understood, at this point, the question of what to do with the men who had built the camps and staffed the bureaucracies and signed the orders. This was a question everyone was beginning to ask, and no one had answered in any way that felt permanent or complete. But that was not what had happened, or rather, it was not all of what had happened. What had happened also included a man named Renwick, who had emerged from a position that offered no cover and said something in a corridor that ended a man's bargaining, before the bargaining could succeed. And then it stood 15 meters away in full daylight and vanished between one moment and the next. What had happened included a Field Marshal's 7 words, and a French car with men who did not identify themselves, and a road with dust settling back into the particular silence of a morning that had just finished deciding something. "The British handled it," Whitfield said finally. Morris nodded. "They usually do." He drank his water and left, satisfied with an answer that explained nothing. That night, Whitfield dreamed of dust. Not the German roads, but the training grounds outside London where he had first seen SAS operatives moving through a demonstration exercise 18 months before the Rhine crossing, before Italy, before Normandy, when he was still new enough to the war to believe that what he was being shown was the whole of what existed to be shown. They had disappeared then, too, into hedgerows that should not have concealed a child, into shadows that did not exist until they needed to. He had thought it was performance, a show put on for Allied observers. He understood now that he had been watching men practice being absent. They were rehearsing the skill of not existing until the moment existence became necessary, and of returning to non-existence once the necessity had passed, leaving nothing behind that could be measured or named or entered into any record. He woke at 0417 with that thought fully formed and no one to explain it to. Outside, something was burning. Not the town, which had been burning for days and had run out of things to surrender to it, but something smaller, more deliberate. Someone's campfire, probably. The smell of it came through the window frame and mixed with the smell of the room, which smelled of the war, and Whitfield lay in his borrowed bed, in his borrowed farmhouse room, in the country that had done the thing it had done, and was now beginning the long process of finding a way to live with itself, and thought about Renwick. He thought about what Renwick had said to Beckman in the corridor. He would think about this for decades, as it turned out, would return to it in the small hours of various nights, in Chicago, in the house on Elmwood Avenue, where he and Margaret raised 3 children, and a garden, and a marriage that survived his distance, if not always comfortably. He had not heard the words.
He would never know the words. But he could work backwards from the effect. Beckman had been offering, then Renwick had spoken, and then Beckman had stopped. Not because he was threatened, not because he had run out of things to offer, because something in what Renwick said had made the offering pointless in a way that transcended fear or calculation. The only explanation Whitfield could arrive at, lying in his borrowed room in the dark, was that Renwick had told him the truth. Not a threat and not a promise, but the simple, factual truth of his situation, stated in terms that Beckman could not dispute or maneuver around. Because the truth was not a position you could argue against. It simply was. And Beckman, who had spent his career in a world of positions and arguments and the negotiation of reality toward preferred outcomes, had encountered something he had no mechanism for, and had simply stopped. The war ended 11 days later. Whitfield processed through the Occupation Administration for another 4 months, interviewing civilians, cataloging damages, writing reports that no one would read for decades. The work was necessary and strange, and occasionally unbearable in ways that had nothing to do with danger. The danger had mostly passed. What remained was a kind of moral archaeology, the daily excavation of what had happened here, in this house, in this village, at this administrative level, by whose specific signature and pursuant to whose specific order. The people he interviewed were not, for the most part, monsters. They were farmers and shopkeepers and schoolteachers and civil servants who had made a series of small accommodations across a decade and arrived, without ever quite deciding to arrive, at the far end of an unthinkable transit. He wrote their statements and filed them and tried not to carry them home in the evenings, with mixed success. He saw SAS personnel twice more during this period. Once at a checkpoint near Lübeck, where a group of 3 men in the indefinite clothing that seemed to be their standard uniform moved through a roadblock without stopping. The MPs at the checkpoint exhibiting the particular studied inattention of people who have been told clearly and once to see nothing. And once at a requisitioned hotel in Hamburg, where Allied officers gathered for a coordination meeting that accomplished nothing beyond establishing that everyone involved had different priorities that they were willing to express in polite language. Both times he scanned faces looking for Renwick. Both times he saw only strangers. Men with the same quality of distributed readiness, the same absence of insignia, the same German boots worn to the particular shapelessness of long use. But not Renwick. He had understood, by Hamburg, that he would not find Renwick by looking. Renwick was findable only when Renwick chose to be found. In September, he shipped home through Southampton, 5 days on a transport that smelled of diesel and vomit, and the particular exhaustion of men who had survived something they could not yet name. There was a quality to those 5 days that he would remember always as being outside normal time. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, a passage between 2 states of being that had no proper duration. Men played cards, men slept, men stood at the railings and watched the Atlantic go past in the September gray and did not speak to each other. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had too much, and none of it had found its words yet. His wife Margaret met him at Union Station in Chicago, thinner than he remembered, wearing the blue dress from their last dinner before deployment. She had come to America from Winnipeg at the age of 18 to study at Northwestern, and had stayed, the way Canadians sometimes stayed in cities that seemed to require them, and she had married Whitfield at 24 in a register office in London, with 2 of his army friends as witnesses,
and her sister on a bad transatlantic telephone line, and the understanding clear to both of them that whatever they were beginning would be worked out in real time without a template. She had lived through the war in Chicago, teaching secondary school mathematics and writing him letters that were careful and informative, and gave away less of what she was feeling than he had wanted, but more, he suspected now, than she had intended. He had read them in Sicily and Normandy and the Rhineland, and they had been a kind of anchor, not because they were warm exactly, but because they were true, because Margaret was constitutionally unable to perform an emotion she did not have, which meant that the reserve in her letters was a form of honesty, and that the moments when the reserve broke were moments you could trust. She held him for 19 seconds. He counted, unable to stop himself, the habit of precision having survived everything the war had done to him, and then stepped back and looked at his face with the expression of someone examining a photograph that has been altered in ways she cannot identify. "You're different," she said. "Everyone's different." "No." She touched his cheek with 2 fingers, the way she had touched him on their wedding night when she was still learning the geography of his face. "You're somewhere else even when you're here." He did not know how to tell her she was wrong. He was entirely here. He was simply aware now that here and there were not as separate as he had believed, that a man could stand 15 meters away in full daylight and not exist until he chose to, that the visible world was a consensus maintained by people who had agreed not to look too closely at its edges, and that some men had stepped outside that agreement and could not entirely step back in, and that some of what they had carried out there had come home with them, whether or not the men themselves had. He tried, in the weeks that followed, to become ordinary again. He went to the railway clerk job that his father would have wanted for him, not railways, but something comparable, an administrative position at a shipping company on the North Side, work that required precision and patience, and the management of systems that did not behave perfectly, but behaved consistently enough to be corrected. He was good at this. He had always been good at managing systems. The philosophy degree from McGill had given him, among other things, a tolerance for abstract structures, for entities that existed without having physical presence, and this turned out to be useful in shipping as in other things. 3 weeks after his return, at a dinner party hosted by his father's law partner, Whitfield found himself seated beside a retired colonel who had spent the war in Washington coordinating supply logistics. The colonel asked what he had seen in Germany. "I saw an SS officer transferred to French custody," Whitfield said, which was true. "Good," the colonel said. "Should have been more of that." He helped himself to more wine with the satisfaction of a man confirming a long-held position. A British operative was involved. SAS. Ah. The colonel nodded with the satisfaction of a man confirming his suspicions. The sneaky ones. Heard they're quite good. Commandos and such. Whitfield tried to find words for what quite good meant when applied to Renwick. He tried to explain that good was not the right word, that right was not the right word, that there was no word in English for a man who could be present and absent simultaneously, who could look at an SS officer offering information in exchange for his life and see something other than a transaction, who could make a transfer feel like completion and a refusal feel like the most precise kind of honor, who could say something in a corridor to a man who had spent his career ordering deaths and stop that man cold, not with threat, but with truth. "Yes," he said finally, "they're quite good." The conversation moved on to real estate prices, and whether Truman would win in '48, and whether the new highway proposals would hurt the North Side property values. And Whitfield ate his steak and smiled at the appropriate moments and said nothing else of substance for the remainder of the evening. He drove home through the Chicago streets, past the lit windows of buildings full of people who had lived through the war at a remove, through the newspapers and the radio and the gold star flags in windows, and thought about the gap between what he had seen and what he had said, and whether that gap was dishonesty or simply the recognition that some things cannot travel across the distance between the people who saw them and the people who did not. Margaret was reading when he got home, sitting in the kitchen with tea and a library book. She looked up when he came in and read his face the way she had learned to read it. "Hard evening," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said, "just distant." She went back to her book and he sat across from her, and they were quiet together for a while, which was one of the things they did well. And after a time the distance closed somewhat, or at least became companionable, which was perhaps all you could ask of it. In 1951, Whitfield was offered a position at the University of Chicago, teaching in the history department, a junior appointment that suited him well enough that it became a senior appointment, and then a tenure, and then a career. He taught modern European history, which meant he taught the war, which meant he spent 30 years standing in front of rooms full of young people and explaining things he had been present for in terms that they could understand and follow and take notes on. He was good at this too. He had learned by then the discipline of the explicable, the art of choosing which parts of a truth could be transmitted and which parts could not survive the crossing. He never taught the detention facility at Wesel. He never taught the French staff car or the 7 words, or the moment when Renwick said something in a corridor and a man who had ordered the deaths of 642 civilians stopped speaking. He taught the Oradour massacre itself, the operational logic of the atrocity, the Das Reich division's movements through the Haute-Vienne in June of 44, the subsequent trials, the decades of French judicial and commemorative reckoning. He taught it clearly and fully, from the documentary record and the survivor testimony and the scholarly literature. He simply did not teach the part he had personally seen, because the part he had personally seen was not teachable. It required presence to understand. It required having stood in the dust of a German road in April and watched something occur that had no category. 23 years after the Rhine crossing, in October of 1968, Whitfield attended a lecture at the University of Chicago on the occupation of Germany. The lecturer was a young historian who had interviewed dozens of participants and compiled their accounts into what he called an administrative history of Allied governance. He spoke for 90 minutes about logistics, about denazification protocols, about the challenges of rebuilding infrastructure while simultaneously punishing those who had built it for the wrong purposes. He was thorough and careful and had clearly done serious archival work. He spoke about the formal structures with the confidence of someone who had found the structures and believed the structures were the thing. During the question period, Whitfield raised his hand. "You've discussed the formal structures," he said, "the military government, the tribunals, the documentation processes. But were there ever—" He paused, looking for the right word and knowing he would not find it. "Individuals who operated outside those structures, who made decisions about specific cases before the formal apparatus was in place?" The lecturer frowned, considering. There were certainly irregular forces during the immediate post-combat period. SOE elements, some OSS activity, the various resistance networks. But by the time formal occupation began, these had been largely integrated into— "No," Whitfield said. "I mean during the transition. During the days when combat was ending but occupation hadn't begun. When someone had to decide on the spot what to do with specific individuals who presented themselves." The lecturer looked at him with the patient expression of a man who had heard many such questions from veterans who believed their individual experiences represented historical truth. "If you have specific recollections, Mr. Whitfield, Captain, Canadian Army, retired." Captain Whitfield. "If you have specific recollections, I'd be very interested to record them for the archive. The informal decision-making processes of the transition period are, as you suggest, understudied." Whitfield thought about describing Renwick. He thought about explaining how a man could materialize from a position that contained no cover, how that man could look at human beings and see something other than their utility, how Montgomery himself, 30 kilometers away, with a war to finish, had apparently understood that the occupation of Germany would be won or lost in the first hours by men who knew the difference between intelligence and corruption and had deployed accordingly. He thought about the French car. He thought about the 7 words, "I'll contact you," he said, and did not. He walked home from the lecture through the October campus, past the Gothic buildings that always made him think of the M. Gill Quad in autumn, and tried to articulate to himself why he had not spoken. It was not shame, and it was not uncertainty about whether he had seen what he had seen. It was something more structural. The account required Renwick, and Renwick required explanation. And the explanation was that some men operate outside the documented world not because they are lawless, but because the law as written cannot contain the full range of what justice requires. He could say that. He could say it in a lecture hall, but saying it did not transmit it. You needed the boots and the scar and the particular quality of stillness at 15 meters, and the moment when a man who had ordered 642 deaths stopped speaking because someone had told him the truth about himself. You needed the dust and the crow and the 1423 on his watch, and the empty grass where something had been and then was not. These were not things you could put in an archive. Or rather, you could put them in an archive, but once you did, they would become documents. And they were not documents. They were instances of something that documentation would convert into its opposite. He went home and had dinner with Margaret, and they watched the news, which was full of the Democratic Convention's aftermath, and Vietnam, and the feeling that the world was accelerating towards something that could not be named. And after dinner, he read for a while. And at some point in the reading, he fell asleep in his chair and dreamed of nothing he could remember. On the morning of his 74th birthday in 1989, Whitfield sat in his study in the house where he had lived for 31 years and looked at a photograph he had never shown anyone. It was not a photograph of Renwick. He had never photographed Renwick, had never thought to, had perhaps understood that such a photograph would show only empty ground. It was a photograph of the checkpoint road, taken from the position where the Willies had stopped, showing the dust that rose from the German approach, and the tree line beyond, and the sky that had been pale that morning with the promise of April warmth. He had taken the photograph in the minutes after Renwick's disappearance, when he was still trying to verify that the morning had occurred at all. He had been carrying a small camera, a Voigtländer that had belonged to a German officer and been passed around the staff as useful. The German lenses were better than anything Allied supply could produce, which was one of those small ironies the war was full of. He had raised the camera almost automatically, the way you reach for a pen when you want to fix something in place. It showed nothing of significance. A road, some trees, the ordinary landscape of a country that had done extraordinary evil and was now attempting to become ordinary again. He had kept it in a drawer for 44 years, moving it from Chicago apartment to Elmwood Avenue house to the study where he now sat, transferring it each time with the care of something that could not be replaced, though it contained nothing that could not be found in 100 similar photographs of German roads in April 1945. What it contained that could not be found elsewhere was his knowledge of what the photograph was of the absence it recorded, the presence it had followed, the question it had been attempting to answer when the shutter closed. His granddaughter found him there 2 hours later, still holding the photograph, and asked what he was looking at. Germany, he said. April, 1945. What happened there? He looked at her, 18 years old, starting college in the fall, born into a world where the war was history rather than memory, where Orador was a name in a textbook and the Rhine crossing was a chapter heading, and the occupation of Germany was something that had led, through processes she could study, to the divided post-war world she had grown up in. She had grown up in it competently, and would navigate it competently, and would make her own choices and errors within it, and none of that competence required knowing what he knew. He thought about the answer, the true answer, the answer he had been trying to formulate for 44 years. It went like this. A man appeared from ground that could not conceal him. He ensured that a specific piece of justice occurred that the formal apparatus was not yet in place to deliver. He said something to a man who had ordered hundreds of deaths that stopped that man speaking. Then he vanished, and the dust settled, and the road was empty. I never learned his last name. I never learned where he went after that April morning, whether the war swallowed him or the peace did, whether he survived into an ordinary life in some ordinary town and grew old, watching the dust in the sunlight, or whether men like him do not survive into ordinariness, whether the particular form of being that allows a person to operate at the edge of the visible world eventually consumes the visibility itself. I only know that he was there, in the dust and the April light, and then he was not there, and the war ended, and I have been watching the dust ever since and trying to explain what I saw in it. Nothing I could explain, he said. She nodded and left him alone with the photograph, and the morning light falling through the study window onto the desk, and the papers, and the ordinary objects of a long life that had been lived mostly at the safe distance from what it had once come close to. He set down the photograph and looked at the dust motes drifting through the sunlight. Actual dust, house dust, the fine particulate debris of inhabited space, nothing like the road dust of the German approach, but obeying the same physics, rising and drifting and settling and rising again, in the air currents that moved through the room wherever he shifted his weight, or the heating clicked on, or a door opened somewhere in the house. He had watched dust for 44 years. Not obsessively, not pathologically. Margaret would have noticed, would have said something precise and unarguable about it in the kitchen over tea, The way she said things that needed to be said. Just attentively. The way you watch something that carries within it, if you watch it long enough and with enough honesty, a record of everything it has moved through. The dust on the German road had carried the war in it. The dust in the farmhouse at Wesel had carried the occupation in it. The dust in his study on Elmwood Avenue carried 44 years of a life lived in the knowledge that the visible world is thinner than it appears, that the edge of what can be seen is not the edge of what exists, that some men have learned to step across that edge and return, and that what they bring back with them changes the weight of everything they stand near. He set down the photograph and looked at the dust motes drifting through the sunlight. And after 44 years, he finally understood what the brigadier had meant about witnesses. Not recorders, not testifiers. Witnesses in the older sense, the sense the word carried before testimony became a legal term and memory became evidence. People who have seen something and carry it intact through time, not to report it, but to anchor it, to prevent it from becoming only a document, to keep alive in the world the knowledge that it happened and had weight and required of the people who saw it a response they were not entirely equipped to give. The dust, he thought, remembering the first moments of that April morning when the gray staff car had appeared on the German road and the dust had risen behind it in the still air and hung there for a long moment before beginning its slow return to the surface. The dust that rose and settled and rose again and carried within it everything that had happened and would happen and could not be explained in any language he had spent his career teaching people to use. He had watched the dust that morning. He had watched it on every morning since. He was watching it still.